Hello and welcome back to Animated Banners with CSS. Now that we've charted out what our entire animation is going to look like from start to finish, we can start to build our animations in CSS. And the one I want to start with is going to be our heading text where it says everything is 30% off. We're going to start animating this on and off the stage as well as the other heading text that's going to replace it when it animates off. And if we look in Photoshop at the chart that we created in the last video, we can see that we have two separate animations that we need to create. And we've discussed this before. The first animation is this column over here on the left where a few items are just initially animating onto the banner. That particular animation is only going to happen once. The rest of these animations are all going to loop. These are all going to happen over and over again as long as the user has the browser window open. So in this video, we're going to focus on our heading animations. And for our first initial animation, we only have one that we need to animate on. We don't need to animate on heading 2 because it doesn't come on until halfway through the other animation. So we're just going to animate heading 1 on. Now, right now, as you can clearly see, the first heading is already in place where it needs to be after it animates on. So this actually needs to start off away from the banner. We don't want to see it when our browser first opens. We want to see it animate on. And I want it to animate in from the left. I want it to move in behind the tree and move into place where it is right here. So let's take a look at where it is. Let's jump into our CSS. And I've moved everything into the banner 09 folder. So all the changes we make in this lesson will be saved there. And I'm going to open up banner.html, banner.css, and animations.css. And if we look at banner.css, we can scroll about halfway down and find the rules for text heading 01 and text heading 02. And the rule for text heading 01 says that the left position is at 400 pixels. So where we see it right now on the banner, it's at a left position of 400 pixels. That's going to be the ending point of this initial animation where it animates onto the stage. So I want to initially push it off far enough to the left side of the banner that we don't see any of the right part of the text sticking into the banner itself. So I'm going to nudge it to a left position of about -500 pixels, and that should get it far enough off so that we don't see that text there. And then we'll animate it on again to a value of 400 pixels. So it's going to animate from a 0% keyframe of -500 pixels to a 100% keyframe of 400 pixels. So let's jump back into our code. And let's start by just taking this off the stage and putting it at a value of -500 pixels. So we'll save that, and when we take a look at our browser and refresh, we see that our text disappears. It actually moves way over here to the left, and that's a good start. So now we want to animate it on. And later on, we'll talk about how to make this text disappear when it's not hovering over the banner itself. But again, we'll get to that later on. Right now, I like it like it is because we can see what's happening as we animate it. So it's over here to the left of the stage now. So let's create our animation to bring it on. So let's jump back into TextMate. Let's go to animations.css. And before we actually do this, let me go ahead and make a couple copies of the animation we've already created so that we don't forget to do that later. Remember, we talked about the different vendor prefixes that we need for these animations, for these keyframe animations. And for the most part, a case can be made that all you really need are the @keyframes rule and the @webkit keyframes rule, because Mozilla browsers and Opera handle the @keyframes rule pretty well. The latest version of Internet Explorer also handles @keyframes really well. Now, anything Internet Explorer 9 and before, they're not going to support keyframes at all. So you can forget about these animations for older versions of Internet Explorer. It's only version 10 that supports the keyframe animations for Internet Explorer. But the other browsers, Mozilla and Opera browsers, those handle the @keyframes rule pretty well, but I like to go ahead and include those vendor prefixes just to be safe. So we have our first one here. Let's just copy that, and I'm going to paste it 1, 2, 3 times, and we'll go ahead and put a line break in between these to give a little breathing room in there. And so we have our first WebKit one. We'll change the second one to MOZ for Mozilla. We'll change the third one to the letter O for Opera Don't make that a 0, make sure it's an O. And then our last one is just going to be at keyframes. Notice that it's not at hyphen keyframes, it's just at keyframes and then the name of the animation. So that takes care of that one. Now let's move all of these down further than we need to, just so we have a little breathing room up here. And then let's create our animation for animating our text, our heading text, onto the stage for the initial animation. So we'll use the at keyframes rule here, and let's label this one heading 01 hyphen on. This is when we're initially going to animate it onto the stage. And again, we're going to have a 0% keyframe and a 100% keyframe. It's going to start at a left value of -500 pixels like we've discussed, and it's going to end at a left value of 400 pixels. And that should take care of the initial animation of the heading animating onto the banner. Now it's important that we remember to actually tie the heading text itself to this animation, so we still need to do that. But before we do that, let's go ahead and make copies of this. So I'm going to, actually before we do that, let's just make sure it works. So let's use the WebKit keyframe here since I'm testing it in Chrome. And let's make sure this works before we actually make multiple copies of it. That way we don't have to fix it in multiple places if something goes wrong. So again, we're just going to use the -WebKit -keyframes rule for now. Let's save animations.css, jump into banner.css, and we'll find this text heading rule here, and we'll create our animation. So again, I'm just going to test it in WebKit for now. So I'm going to type -WebKit -animation. And the animation we're pointing to here is the one that we called heading 01 -on. We want this animation to last 1 second, so we'll type 1s, and then we'll leave the rest of the settings there on the default settings. So it's going to ease in and out of the animation. There's going to be no delay, and it's not going to loop. So let's save that, and let's test it in our browser. So we'll jump back to our browser, refresh our page, and now we see our text animate on. Now we have a small problem there. You'll notice once it got to the end of the animation, it jumped back to its initial state. And we can see that happen again if we refresh our browser. So it animates on, then it suddenly jumps back. Well, that's a very easy fix. All we need to do is go into our animation here, and after 1 second, I'm also going to type the word forwards. Once we do that, save it, refresh our page. Now, once it gets to the end of that animation, it stays where it ended up. So we've got the first part of our animation, or the first animation itself, finished. Now we have the longer, more complicated animation for this banner to take care of. So before we get to that, let's go back to our code and let's make sure we cover all of our bases as far as vendor prefixes are concerned. Now I'm not going to worry about the vendor prefixes for this just yet because we have more that we're going to add to this. So I'm going to leave this one alone until we're done with it, but I'm going to go ahead and jump to the animations.css file. And this animation here is complete. So we can go ahead and make copies of this. And that's one thing you want to keep in mind. You want to go ahead and test one version of that rule first and make sure you get it completely finished and completely working before you make other copies and do your vendor prefixes. Otherwise, you're going to be making changes in multiple copies of your animation, and that's obviously a bit of a pain. So with this heading 1 on animation highlighted here, I'm just going to copy it and I'm going to paste it 1, 2, 3 times, and then we'll just fix our vendor prefixes here. And there we go. So now we've got all 4 versions of that animation working just fine. And obviously I would encourage you to go ahead and test that in different browsers, including Internet Explorer 10 and Mozilla browsers and Opera browsers, etc. But that wraps it up for our initial heading 1 animation. In the next video, we'll go ahead and fill out our second looping animation, which is going to be a little bit more complicated. So let's save all of our files. And then once again, before we move on, I'm just going to refresh our page just to make sure that nothing broke in the process of adding those other vendor prefixes. And everything still looks fine. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next video. Thank you for watching.